Code is amended by inserting 25E after 25D, both places it appears. 3. Section 25A I-5B of such code is amended by inserting 25E after 25D. 4. Section 25B G2 of such code.
Is there objection?
Objection
Objection is heard. Clerk will continue reading.
4. Section 25B G2 of such code is amended by inserting 25E after 25D. 5. Sections 25D C1B and 25D C2A of such code are both amended by inserting and Section 25E after this section. 6. Section 26A1 of such code is amended by inserting 25E after 25D. 7. Section 30C2BII of such code is amended by inserting 25E after 25D. 8. Section 30B G2BII of such code is amended by inserting 25E after 25D. 9. Section 30D C2BII of such code is amended by striking sections 23 and 25D and inserting sections 23, 25D, and 25E. 10. Section 1400 CD of such code is amended by inserting 25E after 25D, both places it appears. C. Clerical amendment. The table of sections for Subpart A of Part 4 of Subchapter A of Chapter 1 of such code is amended by inserting after the item relating to Section 25D the following new item. Section 25E, credit for taxpayers subject to a tax increase under the Small Business Paperwork Mandate Elimination Act of 2011. D, effective date. The amendments made by this section shall apply to taxable years beginning after December 31, 2013. Section 6, income attributable to domestic production activities. A, in general, subparagraph B of Section 19(9)(c)(4) of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 as amended by striking "and" at the end of clause II and striking the period at the end of clause III and inserting "and by inserting after clause III the following new clause. 4. In the case of a major integrated oil company as defined in Section 167H5, the production, refining, processing, transportation, or distribution of oil, gas, or any primary product thereof. B, effective date. The amendment made by subsection A shall apply to taxable years beginning after December 31, 2014. Section 7, major integrated oil companies ineligible for last in, first out method of inventory. A, in general, Section 471 of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 is amended by redesignated subsection C as subsection D and by inserting after subsection B the following new subsection. C, major integrated oil companies ineligible for last in, first out method. In the case of a major integrated oil company as defined in Section 167H5B. 1. The last in, first out method of determining inventories shall in no event be treated as clearly reflecting income. And 2. Section 472 and 473 shall not apply. B, effective date. 1. In general, the amendments made by this section shall apply to taxable years beginning after December 31, 2014. 2. Change in method of accounting. In the case of any taxpayer required by the amendments made by this section to change its method of accounting for its first taxable year beginning after December 31, 2014, A, such change shall be treated as initiated by the taxpayer. B, such change shall be treated as made with the consent of the Secretary of the Treasury. And C, if the net amount of the adjustments required to be taken into account by the taxpayer under Section 481 of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 is positive, such amount shall be taken into account over a period of 8 years beginning with such first taxable year.
What purpose, gentleman from Michigan, rise?
Madam Speaker, I insist on my point of order. I make a point of order against the motion because it violates Clause 10 of Rule 21, as it has the net effect of increasing mandatory spending within the time period set forth in the rule and I ask for a ruling of the chair.
Does any member wish to be heard on the point of order?
Madam Speaker, I appeal the ruling of the chair.
Does the gentleman wish to
Oh.
be heard on the point of order?
So just go ahead and read this. Okay, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman from Connecticut,
Everyone knows
California,
that-
excuse me.
Madam Speaker, everyone knows that times are tough and that individuals, families, and small businesses are having a difficult time making ends meet. That's why it's so important that we provide small businesses, who are the backbone of our economy, with the tools to succeed.
Does the gentleman wish to address the point of order?
Yes, the gentleman wishes to address the point of order.
Chair will hear the gentleman.
With rising prices of gasoline and unemployment that remains far too high, helping small businesses is more important than ever.
The point of order.
Does the gentleman from California wish to address the specific point of order? The other member wish to address this point of order? Gentleman from Michigan.
Madam Speaker, the gentleman from California was addressing the point of order. I think he should be allowed to do so.
Does any other member wish to?
Wait a minute. He should be allowed to continue.
The gentleman from California may be heard only on the point of order. And continue if he is speaking directly to the point of order.
Madam Speaker, this directly addresses the tax provision in the Republican bill.
The gentleman may proceed.
This motion to recommit addresses the pay-for in the bill.
The gentleman may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm a former small business owner, and while I strongly supported our efforts to reform the health care
Madam
system...
Speaker, regular order. The gentleman is not addressing the point of order.
Madam Speaker.
The chair will hear the speaker from California.
I urge the gentleman to let him
Regular
speak.
order, Madam Speaker.
Members will suspend.
We have a paid-for
Chair-
tax cut that's germane and included in the bill, in the motion to recommit.
Gentleman may proceed. The chair will hear comments from all members on the point of order only. The gentleman from California continues to be recognized.
While I strongly supported our efforts to reform the health care system, I also supported repealing the 1099 reporting requirement. This requirement will negatively affect small businesses' ability to operate smoothly and efficiently. There's a broad bipartisan consensus on this point, and I've received many emails, phone calls, and letters from constituents in my district who oppose the 1099 reporting requirement. I support repealing the 1099 provision.
Gentleman will suspend. Must be confined to the procedural issue at hand with regard to the point of order.
We have a paid-for tax cut that is in order.
Does any other member wish to be heard?
Wait, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman from New York. Oh, excuse me, gentleman from Michigan.
The gentleman wishes to proceed. The gentleman from California wishes to proceed.
Gentleman must speak to the specific procedural
And
question.
he says he's doing so. He's saying he's doing so.
To be objection to that. But gentleman from California may proceed.
I stand here to offer a better alternative, and it's paid for. Instead of simply agreeing to the majority's bill, the motion to recommit would repeal the 1099 requirement and provide a new tax cut to the middle class paid for by closing tax loopholes exploited by large oil companies. It's paid for, and it's germane. Oil companies have earned record profits over the last few years, and it's just unacceptable for them to take advantage of the special loopholes when the middle class is struggling.
All right, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman from Michigan.
The gentleman is not addressing the point of order.
The gentleman from California has not spoken directly to the procedural part of the point of order. The chair will now recognize other members, the gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, thank you for yielding me this time to address the point of order. Madam Speaker, the rules of the House give a modicum of support to the minority to offer motions to address a different point of view on legislation, albeit in the form of the motion to recommit. The rules of the House, Madam Speaker, allow for the minority to express that point through the motion. In this motion to recommit, has been placed forward by the gentleman from California, it is a simple choice between the oil companies and the middle class.
Okay, Madam
Side with
Speaker.
the oil companies or side with the middle
Madam
class.
Speaker.
The rules of the House, Madam Speaker,
Gentlemen.
allow for us to...
Gentleman will suspend. The gentleman is not addressing the procedural issues within the point of order.
Madam Speaker, if I can, I'm addressing the rules of the House that allow for the minority to have an opportunity to make a motion to recommit. It may not be in agreement with the majority. We understand that. They may not like the motion to recommit. We understand that. They may not like the motion to recommit under the rule because it touches on to an area that they're not comfortable with, that is taxing oil
The gentleman
companies.
is not addressing the
Madam Speaker.
procedural issue.
Madam Speaker,
The
I'm
gentleman
talking
is
about the rules of
not.
the House, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman is not sticking precisely to the procedural
I'm-
question at hand.
Madam Speaker, I'm trying to do that. I'm
Madam
trying
Speaker, Madam
to address
Speaker.
Clause
to
10
address
of
the point
Rule
of order.
21.
I would ask the chair to rule.
Madam
I would ask
Speaker,
the chair to rule, Madam Speaker.
Madam Speaker, I wish to be heard. I wish to be heard.
Does any member in the body wish to be heard on Clause 10 of Rule 21?
Yes, I do.
Specifically, gentleman from Michigan.
Madam Speaker, the rules of the House as crafted by the majority do make it difficult for us to craft motions to recommit that are germane. I submit this is, and I think you should listen to us before you make a ruling. You are the Speaker of the House, acting in that capacity. This motion would cut taxes, would end oil subsidies, and ensure more Americans have health insurance. It is germane. The Republicans should not try to gag us. I urge that the Speaker rule this in order.
Madam Speaker, and I would ask the chair to rule.
Madam Speaker,
The chair has heard enough and will be prepared to rule this time.
Point of order.
Does the gentleman from New York have a point of order?
You heard on the point of order. Just because one person you might feel didn't address it doesn't mean all of us should be prejudiced our opportunity to speak.
Argument is at the discretion of the chair
It
to edify her decision.
It is. And I make a point of order.
The
that
chair has ruled that it is time to now rule on the point of order. Gentleman from Michigan makes a point of order that the motion offered by the gentleman from California violates Clause 10 of Rule 21 by proposing an increase in mandatory spending over a relevant period of time. Pursuant to Clause 10 of Rule 21 and Clause 4 of Rule 29, the Chair is authoritatively guided by estimates from the Chair of the Committee on the Budget that the net effect of the provisions in the amendment would increase mandatory spending over a relevant period as compared to the bill. Accordingly, the point of order is sustained and the motion
Mr. Speaker,
is not in order.
Madam Speaker, because of the way this has been handled, I appeal the ruling of the chair.
The question is, the question...
Madam Speaker, I move to lay the appeal upon the table.
I ask for a recorded vote.
The question is, shall the decision of the chair stand as the judgment of the House? For what purpose is the from
Madam
Michigan,
Speaker,
Mr.
I move.
Camprice?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move to lay the appeal on the table.
Motion is on the motion to table. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Ask for a recorded vote.
Gentlemen, ask for the yeas and nays. Yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. And pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this is a 15-minute vote on the motion. To table will be followed by a 5-minute vote on passage of the bill if arising without further proceedings and recommittal.
So 2 votes in this series as the House takes up their first roll call votes of the day. Members holding a procedural vote related to this bill to eliminate a small business tax requirement under the new health care law. After this, we do expect a vote on final passage, which would wrap up the legislative week in the House. Joining us now is Megan McCarthy, who reports for the National Journal. Thanks for being with us today, Megan.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, as members vote on this measure, why is the proposed repeal of the so-called 1099 provision a top priority for House Republicans?
It's something that both Republicans and Democrats have said repeatedly that they want to do. It's one piece of the health care law that has just been widely criticized. Some businesses and small businesses in general or in specific have said that this requirement, which has them filling out 1099 tax forms for all purchases over $600, is just too onerous and will require too many man-hours to fulfill.
And Democrats, where do they stand on the effort to repeal the paperwork requirement?
Democrats also support repealing it. President Obama has said, even in his State of the Union address, that he wants to get this done. The Senate voted successfully last month to repeal the 1099 provision with an 81-17 vote, which was pretty overwhelming support for undoing this.
Well, the House and Senate approved similar legislation last year. What makes this year's effort any different?
Well, the Senate coming to an agreement with 81 votes is a much stronger message than any of the bills they voted on last year. That was actually the first time they voted to repeal. What's happening today, though, in the House is that the House is voting on its own version of repealing, and the way that they pay for that is something that the Senate will likely not accept.
Well, what are the bill's prospects for being passed in the House today?
I think it's almost certainly going to pass in the House without question, but in the Senate it's probably not ever going to get to the floor.
Well, Megan, we do appreciate your time. Megan McCarthy is a reporter for National Journal. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Again, 2 votes in this series. The House taking up their first roll call votes of the day. A vote on final passage expected during this 15-minute vote on a procedural vote, and then a 5-minute vote on final passage. Well, as voting continues on this procedural motion, earlier during floor debate, Congressman Blumenauer called Republicans' comments on the health care law the political lie of the year, quote unquote. Congressman Dan Lundgren of California, who is the sponsor of the bill, objected, saying that the use of such terms is incorrect and it's against House rules. Well, Congressman Blumenauer withdrew the comments and he apologized after a 10-minute review of his comments by House officials. Here is how that played out on the floor.
I thank the gentleman for yielding the time. My name happens to appear on this bill as the original author of this bill, H.R. 4. I remember when I introduced this last April, members on that side of the aisle were told by their leadership, don't dare go on this bill to repeal this necessary provision of the Affordable Care Act. By the way, if it is truly an Affordable Care Act, why has Secretary Sebelius granted over 700 waivers to companies and unions because it's not affordable? Why has virtually every member of my constituency who has health insurance had an increase in their premiums as a direct result of the quote-unquote Affordable Care Act? Just a passing question, because I'm asked that all the time by my constituents. Why did I introduce this? Because Provision 9006 of the bill has nothing to do with affordable care, has everything to do with the capacity of our friends on the other side to find ingenious ways of impacting business, because I guess business is considered bad. Well, I got an answer for you here today to the question of who creates jobs. This is who creates jobs: small business. And this particular section of your so-called Affordable Care Act kills business, kills small business. What does it do? It is based on the assumption that everybody cheats. Why? Because a 1099 form is usually utilized for the purpose of making sure you carry out your obligation to pay payroll tax. But what did we do in the Affordable Care Act, so-called? We increased the reach of 1099s so that when you have no obligation to pay anything, you have to report on the person on the other side of the business transaction so that they supposedly are cheating, and therefore we have what's known as the Universal Snitch Act. The idea that it's going to gain $19 billion, in my judgment, is created out of whole cloth. You have to assume that almost everybody cheats to get your $19 billion. And here's the game here in Washington, D.C. We create a new obligation on business that's never existed before. We then secretly put it in a bill. Virtually no one on this floor knew it was in the bill. And then we score it for gaining $19 billion to the Treasury. And if I dare come to this floor to repeal it, I'm obligated to come up with $19 billion in new taxes or some sort of a spending cut. The American people ought to understand the game that's played. In secret, we pass something like this, which has an unbelievably pernicious effect on business. Now, how does it have such an effect? It requires every single person involved in business or trade to go into accounting to make sure that every time they reach that threshold of $600 or more with anybody they purchase something from, they have to file a 1099. Here's what someone in my district just emailed me, a small business person. A woman. I have 15 employees. As owner, I am the HR department, the bookkeeping department, the administration department, and still serve my customers while surviving this economic climate. It will be a tremendous burden, both in time and dollars, to send out 1099s to all my vendors, appliance manufacturers, parts distributors, other suppliers, utility companies. It is a job killer provision. We brought this H.R. 4 to the floor to get rid of a job killer provision. The other reason why it is a double-edged sword on small business is if you want to minimize the number of 1099s that you file, you will not go to your local hardware store. You will not go to your local restaurant. You will go to the big box store. You'll go to the chain restaurant. And we are killing small business on this floor. So I understand the sincerity on the other side of the aisle of those.
I yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman's recognized.
Of those who are concerned about the middle class. Who do you think small business is? This is the middle class in my district and virtually every district across the country. These are the people who create jobs. You'll put a dagger in their side, and now you come up and argue against passing this legislation because you are concerned about the middle class. You are killing the middle class with a provision in the health care reform bill, so-called. What we are trying to do is to get rid of that. We're trying to help the middle class. We're trying to help the job creators. We're trying to help the people in our districts who don't have jobs. Don't distract the debate on this job killer piece of legislation. Give us some relief, which is being called for all around the country.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Before I yield to Mr. Blumenauer, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from New York.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
I appreciate the comments of my friend from California, and I don't question his motivation. But I would suggest that if the assumption is that we believe everyone cheats, I think that's wrong. What I hear from the other side, not from the gentleman from California, but generally from the other side, is that the belief is the middle class cheats. The middle class cheats, and that's why we have to impose this upon them. And I would use an example of a middle-class businessman or woman. And that businessman or woman who files an individual tax form as a small business person no longer will have to file the 1099 forms, but if they make $88,000 a year and they are 397th percentile of federal poverty, and they have an unexpected increase in income, they will be subject to the $4,460 middle-class tax hike.
I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, a member of the Ways and Means Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. I appreciate that. It's a little interesting when we hear our friends come to the floor with the same talking points. My good friend from California talks about the government takeover of health care, which, of course, PolitiFact called the 2010 political lie of the year, allowing 33 million additional Americans to have access to...
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
State your point.
The gentleman made a personal reference to me, stating that I made a statement on the floor and then called that the biggest lie of the year. Is that, in fact, an appropriate comment to be made on the floor during debate?
Mr. Speaker, he's not...
Gentleman will suspend.
I'm asking the question. I'll make the point of order.
The gentleman from California has not stated a point of order. Would you proceed, state the point?
I would make a point of order that the gentleman has made a personal reference to me and then followed that up by saying that what I said was a lie.
Is the gentleman demanding that words be taken down?
Not at this time, Mr. Speaker, but I would ask that the Speaker would admonish members not to question the motivation of other members in reference to any debate that's taken place.
Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that people listen to what I said.
The gentleman from Oregon will proceed.
What I said was he claimed the government takeover of health care, and I said, which was judged by PolitiFact, an independent journalistic effort, the Republican claim of government takeover was the 2010 political lie of the year. Now, if the gentleman feels uncomfortable that
Mr. Speaker, I ask the gentleman's words be taken down.
Floor debate from earlier today. Again, a vote on a procedural motion related to this health care law revision for small business underway. After this, we expect a vote on final passage, which would wrap up the legislative week in the House. From the Hill this afternoon, a federal judge who struck down the entire health care reform law issued a stay of his ruling in order to give the Obama administration several days, 7 days actually, to file an appeal. The administration asked U.S. District Judge Roger Vinson for a clarification of his January 31st ruling after some states said they would stop efforts to implement the law in light of his decision. The administration is expected to file an appeal. 3 federal judges so far have upheld the health care reform law enacted 11 months ago, while Judge Vinson and another federal judge struck it down. As voting continues on the House floor, joining me is Lisa Mascaro, congressional correspondent for the Tribune-Washington Bureau. Thanks for being with us today, Lisa.
Oh, sure. Thanks for having me.
Well, Vice President Biden is coming to Capitol Hill today, meeting with congressional leaders. What's on their agenda?
Yeah, hi. President Obama tapped Vice President Biden to basically broker this impasse that we see here on the Hill between congressional Democrats and Republicans over the size and sort of scope of the spending cuts that are needed to pass a resolution that would allow the government to keep funding through the remainder of the fiscal year. As you and your listeners there probably know, the Congress passed over the last several days this short-term stopgap measure that President Obama signed into law, and so that averts this potential for a government shutdown that had been looming come Friday if the two sides had been unable to agree. But it's only a stopgap. It's 2 weeks, and the President and the White House don't want to see another short-term measure because they're concerned about the uncertainty they say this could bring to the economy. But it doesn't look like both sides are going to be able to get a resolution in this short 2-week time frame. And so Biden's been sent up here for this meeting today on the Hill with congressional leaders to start talking about options and seeing what they can do.
Who's expected to be at the meeting?
Okay, so it's the sort of top congressional leaders from both parties and both houses. So it would be Speaker John Boehner and Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi from the House, and then on the Senate side, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader from Kentucky.
So now, is the goal here to reach agreement on spending for this fiscal year and to work out how to handle some of the controversial policy provisions, or is it limited to figuring a way to keep the government funded for the rest of the fiscal year?
Well, yeah, I mean that's a really good question. The first order of business is to figure out a way to keep the government funded, right? Because both sides are definitely trying to, avoid a shutdown. Both, polls show that both Democrats and Republicans would be blamed for that. So I think, both sides have made it clear they don't want that. But the bill that the House passed, the House Republicans passed, gosh, what was that? Two weekends ago on early Saturday morning, does have all these policy provisions on there that are going to be very, very difficult for the Senate, the Democratic-led Senate, to agree to. And President Obama has said he would veto the bill. So those policy provisions are, defunding the president's health care law that was passed under the Democratic Congress, all these EPA regulations, bans on providing funds for EPA regulations, a ban on funding for Planned Parenthood, the family planning organization. So there's all that. And there's also this broader kind of conversation about, these votes that are coming up in Congress over, the debt ceiling, whether or not Congress is able will give its consent to raise the legal debt limit. So there are all these sort of other issues out there, and we just don't know yet to what extent any of that will be part of the broader discussion.
Well, as negotiations continue on this, who or what will you be keeping an eye on as things develop over the next couple of weeks?
Oh gosh, well that's also an interesting question. I mean, I think there are a couple issues at play here. The Democrats have essentially offered, a proposal that sort of keeps spending at current levels, the freeze, and then they've, of course, were part of this agreement reached this week to, cut this $4 billion over the next 2 weeks. So the question on the Democratic side will be, how much more are they willing to cut? Voters have this appetite for cutting in the aggregate, but when you start getting into individual programs and policies, education, for example, voters are less interested in that. So Democrats are going to be trying to decide to what extent they are willing to meet the Republicans. And then on the Republican end, the Republicans passed this sweeping bill that is more than $60 billion in cuts, one of the largest single-time cuts of its kind. how much willing are they willing to give, especially with the emboldened ranks in the Republican Party, both in, of course, the majority in the House, but also in the Senate, where they have a lot of the, Tea Party-inspired conservative voters. How much are they going to be willing to sort of come down from that number? So, it's going to be a true, I think, negotiation, and really watching both sides to see what they're willing to give or exchange.
Lisa Mascaro is congressional correspondent for the Tribune Washington Bureau. We appreciate your time today.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. And here in the House, again, members voting on a procedural motion related to the health care law revision for small business. We expect a vote on final passage, which would wrap up the legislative week in the House. Over in the Senate, we're continuing today on the biggest changes to U.S. patent and trademark law in decades. A number of amendments are still pending. One of those would set Defense Department spending for the rest of this budget year. You can see the Senate live on C-SPAN 2. And right now on C-SPAN 3, President Obama is meeting with Mexican President Felipe Calderón. They are discussing political unrest and violence in Libya and, of course, some border issues between the United States and Mexico. You can see live coverage of that on C-SPAN 3.
On this vote, the yeas are 243.
Ms. Clark of New York. Ms. Clark of New York votes no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro already voted.
On this vote, the yeas are 243, the nays are 181. Motion is adopted without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. Will be in order. The House will be in order. Members will kindly stop talking. The Chair would like to make a statement. Members should be aware that debate on a point of order is solely to edify the judgment of the presiding officer. As such, argument on a point of order must be confined to the question of order and may not range to an underlying substantive question. The Chair endeavors to hear such arguments as they may tend to edify her judgment, but when she's prepared to rule, she may decline to hear more. The optimal accommodation of members' desires to argue on a point of order can be achieved only when, first, those seeking recognition for the purpose properly confine themselves to the question of order, and second, those who believe they have heard enough leave it to the presiding officer to decide when she has heard enough. The Chair enlists the understanding and cooperation of all members in these matters. Question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The ayes have it. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
Madam Speaker, I rise to a point of order. Recorded vote.
The gentleman will.
I'm
the
sorry.
Chair asks the chamber to be quiet. The gentleman will state his point of order.
Madam Speaker, regular order, please. Madam Speaker,
House will be in order.
the voice vote we just took violates Clause 5B of Rule 21, and this vote shall be taken with the 3/5 required for passage.
Does any member wish to speak to the point of order?
Madam Speaker, I do.
Madam Speaker.
Objection?
Madam Speaker.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Is there objection to what? I made a point of order.
Does the gentleman from New York wishes to be heard on the point of order?
Thank you. Madam Speaker, as we all know here, we have a special rule in the House. As I just referenced, it's Clause 5B of Rule 21. That was put into the rules of the House to make it extraordinarily difficult for us to change tax rates. The reason we did that was out of a bipartisan consideration that we wanted to make sure that legislation we did here didn't have the effect, under the ruse of some other action, of changing effective tax rates for people. So this rule was put into place that said if you're going to do that, you need to have a 3/5 majority. Well, this bill that we're considering now is, by its action, changing people's effective tax rates. For example, if you strike an amount, you wind up getting an amount of a raise that...
The House will be in order. The gentleman, anybody who is speaking deserves to be heard. Chair would ask the House to please be in order. Who wants to have a conversation, please kindly take it off the House floor. Thank you. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll try to be brief. Just I know many members hadn't been tuned into the debate, and I want to explain this point. What the bill would do, if it were to be passed, would be to say if someone had a marginal increase in their income that took them up into a next bracket, they would lose not only the subsidy provided under the Health Care Act to buy insurance, but in its entirety. A $200 increase above the bracket would essentially put them into a different tax bracket. This is exactly what this rule was intended to prevent, us taking an action that unwittingly changed where people's tax rates were without us actually having to stand up and do it. This rule puts a pretty strong level of test into place for us. It says we need a 3/5 majority. It's very difficult for the chair to rule about a 3/5, A, in a voice vote. Secondly, I want to be sure that if we go to what is certainly going to be a recorded vote, that... First of all, I mean, I can be accused of a lot of things. Not speaking to a point of order isn't one of them. This point of order is specifically whether or not the rule that we have that says that the movement within tax brackets is subject to a higher order. And let me also make this argument in support of the point of order. The gentleman does not control the time. Point of order. I'm on my feet to a point of order. I cannot be taken off my feet by anyone except the chair. I would urge the respect of the gentleman.
The chair will continue hearing the gentleman from New York.
The reason why this is so important that we enforce now is just as we all have in our rules the annotations of when this rule has been bent and broken, We don't want to, at the beginning of this Congress, one of the earliest actions we do is bend and break and leave in shatters the 3/5 requirement. This is a clear case where the changes, and you might believe it's a good thing to do, I just think there should be at least 3/5 of us under the rules that we agreed upon to raise the tax bracket, particularly since it's on middle-class Americans. When you're making $80-some-odd thousand a year and you make an extra $200 in income, they want to increase your tax bracket. If we're going to do that, let's make sure it's with a 3/5 majority. And I urge that the point of order be upheld, and we have to vote on this by 3/5.
Gentleman from New York, Mr. Crowley, wishes to be heard on the point of order specifically.
On the point of order, Madam Speaker, specifically, let me just clarify for my friends on the other side and on our side of the aisle as well, for all members of the House, that the House rules, Clause 5B of Rule 21 states that passage again of a tax increase needs a 3/5 majority of those present for passage. If we are changing the tax rate or the brackets of individuals, I know it's not, again, comfortable, but as the example I laid out in the debate, which was not refuted by anyone, if an individual earning $88,000 of a family of 4 receives a $250 bonus, that would require them to pay $4,460 in tax, is indeed a new tax, and therefore should be subject to this rule, that we would require 3/5. I know it's hard, because that's the difficulty of this in changing the tax rates. It should be difficult. That's the rule, to make this bipartisan. We do this together, a 3/5 vote. And, Madam Speaker, we are changing the tax rates, we are changing the brackets, and therefore this rule ought to be imposed.
Madam Speaker.
Does the gentleman from Michigan wish to be heard?
I do wish to be heard. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would refer the members of the House to the committee report in this area. And in that committee report, it states the committee has carefully reviewed the provisions of the bill and states that the provisions of this bill do not involve any federal income tax rate increases within the meaning of the rule. And I would say that the rules of the House in this area refer to specific sections of the Internal Revenue Code. Also, the rules of the House, and I would say my friends are not going far enough in their reading of the rules, say that the rules define exactly what an income tax increase is. This bill does not amend those specific sections of the code that are referred to in the rules, so accordingly a point of order does not lie.
Gentleman from Michigan.
From the bill. If the advance payments to a taxpayer exceed the credit allowed by this section, the tax imposed by this chapter for the taxable year shall be increased.
Gentleman from Texas wish to be heard?
Madam Speaker?
Does gentleman from Texas wish to be heard on this point of order?
Yes, Madam Speaker. The point of order began with the words, whether or not. No point of order can begin with the words, whether or not. Yield back.
Madam Speaker.
The chair is prepared to rule.
Madam Speaker, may I be heard further on the gentleman from Michigan's point?
Gentleman from New York.
Let me just say very briefly, the gentleman from Michigan is correct. We don't directly do what is described in the rule, but the effect is that it can be indisputed that someone who is one tax bracket after this bill will move into another one. The purpose of this rule, and clear from the annotations, we're trying to look at the purpose of this rule, and the reason we have the Speaker interpreting the rule is to prevent that from happening. And if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. You're going to see it happening a lot this term.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm prepared to hear the chair's ruling.
Madam Speaker.
Gentleman from New York,
yes.
For a brief moment.
Does the committee report get to waive the House rules? Does the committee report get to waive the House rules? The committee report? That's the evidence to waive the House rules? That's a new low standard.
The chair is prepared to rule. House will be in order to hear the ruling. Since the 105th Congress, the requirement in Clause 5B of Rule 21 for a 3/5 vote on a certain tax measures has comprised the 3 elements described by Speaker Pro Tem Baldwin in the ruling of January 18, 2007. The first element of the requirement is that the measure amends one of the subsections of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 that are cited in the rule. The second element is that the measure does so by imposing a new percentage as a rate of tax. The third element is that in doing so, the measure increases the amount of tax imposed by any of those cited subsections of the code. The Chair is unable to find a provision in the pending bill, H.R. 4, as perfected, that fulfills even the first element of the requirement. A bill that does not meet any one of the three elements required by Clause 5B of Rule 21 does not carry a federal income tax rate increase within the meaning of that rule. Accordingly, the Chair holds the majority vote is sufficient to pass the pending bill, and the Chair properly announce the result of the voice vote on passage.
Ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested on passage of the bill. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
So a vote now on final passage of this bill on health care law revision for small business. This bill eliminates requirements that small businesses file a 1099 form with the IRS for any payments $600 or above to vendors. It also requires health care subsidies to individuals to be repaid if the person receives additional income that pushes them above the limit for receiving health care tax credits. That'll wrap up business in the House for this week. They will hold a quick pro forma session tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. No legislative business will be conducted.
On this vote, the ayes are 314 and the nays are 112. The bill is passed. The bill is passed without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order for 1 minute.